So I'm back at Oak Hill Cemetery. This is going to be the part 2 of this new series on Oak Hill. And I'm going to explore some more history of some amazing people that are buried here. So come along and join me. In case you missed the first video in this series, all of the stories in this video series are taken in part from a book published in 1904 by Hobart and Mather from Chicago called Biographical Review of Calhoun County. The book, as it describes, contains historical, biographical, and genealogical sketches of many of the prominent citizens that were alive during its publication, as well as some from the past. This specific Oak Hill Cemetery video series is about those prominent figures who are in this book and are resting here at Oak Hill Cemetery. Samuel J. Titus was born in Battle Creek on Maple Street to a Quaker family in January 1846. His parents were Richard Titus and Frances Walling Titus. Richard's father was a miller in New Rochelle, New York, and as he was growing up, he worked at the mill. However, when he was a boy, the sea had exercised a powerful fascination for this youth as he lived near the Atlantic, and he was one of the many who sailed the great waters under the mast. He would eventually become a captain and sail the West Indies and South American trades until eventually abandoning the sea. He came to Battle Creek in 1843 when it was then described as a stump village. The following year, he married Frances Walling in Cleveland, Ohio, and brought his bride with him to this new city. For a time, he was engaged in merchandising with Jonathan Hart, and later engaged in the lard and oil business with another man. In 1853, however, he purchased the interest in a local mill owned by Chester Buckley, and along with an associate, Ellery Hicks, became co-owner of the new mill they called Titus and Hicks. Mr. Hicks died soon after taking over ownership, and he was succeeded by his son, William Hicks. Richard Titus passed away in 1868, and his son Samuel took over in his stead. Samuel was 22 years old at the time. Richard's wife, Frances Titus, met Sojourner Truth in 1856 at an abolitionist meeting with the Society of Friends. They would become good friends, and Frances ultimately became the confidant, secretary, tour director, and financial manager for the famous abolitionist speaker. It was through her financial assistance that Sojourner Truth was able to travel to Washington and hold a personal interview with President Lincoln, a meeting that is now a special part of national history. She would later become the editor of Sojourner Truth's biography entitled Narrative of Sojourner Truth, which was published in 1875. Frances would pass away in 1894, and she's buried in the same plot as her husband and son. At an early age, Samuel completed high school in Battle Creek and went on to spend a year in a commercial college. He had put aside his textbooks to pursue a business career and became a bookkeeper for V.P. Collier, a hardware store merchant and furniture store owner in Battle Creek. Here's a photo of V.P. Collier's Union School Furniture Company during that era. He also worked as a bookkeeper for Upton and Brown Threshing Company. In 1867, he began working for his father in the mill and had become active in control of the operation. Despite the shocking loss of his father with his new business partner, he worked in harmony and built the mill up to become one of the most important in the industry in the city. In 1874, they tore down the old mill and erected a new one, which increased the capacity from 25 to 150 barrels of flour a day. In 1885, they did further upgrades to the rollers and increased capacity to 200 barrels a day. The mill operated by water power and became one of the leading producers in the city. Samuel married Miss Kate Hill of East Aurora, New York in November 1871, and together they would have 3 children. The Titus family lived in the same house in which Samuel was born on Maple Street. Samuel Titus for many years was a member of the State Millers Association and served as a director for 7 years, and at one time he was the vice president. For several years he was also the treasurer of the Michigan Millers Mutual Fire Insurance Company, in which he was able to firmly establish a firm financial basis with a cash surplus of over $250,000 by 1904. It was one of the strongest and most reliable mutual insurance companies in the state. Mr. Titus also became a director of the National Bank of Battle Creek in 1894 and held a high level of prominence in the community. He was an active businessman in the community and was involved in organizations like the Elks Club as a member. His wife Kate passed away in 1908 at the age of 56. Samuel would never remarry and would pass away in 1925 after a long illness at the age of 79. After his passing, the Old National Bank would pass a resolution on his death, which reads, "In the loss of Samuel J. Titus, the Old National Bank loses one who has long been identified with its directorate. His cheerful, genial, friendly presence will be missed by his associates on the board. In his relations with us, he has always disclosed a high sense of moral obligation, a fine faithfulness in the discharge of his duty, and a capacity for working in harmony with others, which has made his long association with us one uninterrupted pleasure. He was a gentleman always and a trusted friend. He will be sadly missed, not only by friends on the board, but by hosts of friends throughout the city, in which for so long he was prominent both in business and social relations." When his funeral was held, the event drew attendees from not only all over the city, but also as far away as Detroit and Chicago. William E. Hicks, the business partner of Samuel Titus, has his own unique story. He was born in Perry, New York in June of 1838. His father was Ellery Hicks, and his mother was Maribah Wilcox. In 1851, his parents accompanied their 6 children to Michigan, proceeding by stage from Perry to Buffalo. From there, they went by way of the lake to Detroit and across Michigan by rail until they arrived in Battle Creek. William, however, did not take the same journey. Instead, he was tasked by his father with driving a team of oxen from Detroit to Battle Creek. He was just 13 years old. In 1852, his father purchased interests in the mill and became partners with Richard Titus. He was active in his work at the mill until his death in 1860. William's older brother, George, became a soldier in Company C, 20th Michigan Infantry. He went to the front as a second lieutenant and afterwards was promoted to the rank of captain. He died on the battlefield charging the enemy with the 9th Army Corps. His older brother, Charles, also served in the same company as George and survived the war. William had taken over the family mill after his father passed, and he married Nancy Lawhead in the same year. He would be active as a partner with Richard Titus until his death in 1868, when he then became partners with his son, Samuel. William was remembered as being one of the most energetic and progressive men of Battle Creek in his time, and had a reputation of unbending integrity and industry that never flagged. At the time of his death, he had been a resident of Battle Creek for 70 years. His death came suddenly after he had been ill for just a short time, and it escalated into pneumonia. He passed away in 1921 at the age of 82, 4 years before his business partner, Samuel J. Titus. Now, if you're familiar with my channel and perhaps have followed some of my other videos, you may remember my first video that I did at Hicks Cemetery, where I featured a man named William Hicks. He was an entirely different person with the same name who was a contemporary of this William Hicks. He owned a farm in Penfield, and they both came from New York, so they may be distant cousins, but I could not find any conclusive record that connected them. The next story we're going to look at is that of Miles St. John Curtis. Mr. Curtis was born in Kingsville, Ashtabula County, Ohio, on April 1st, 1852. Less than 3 months after his birth, his mother died, and soon after, his father moved away to Battle Creek, leaving him in the care of 2 uncles. At the age of 14, he was placed in a select school and then spent 4 years at the Austenburg Institute. He received further education education at the Grand River Institute in Ashtabula County, and in his final year there, he was a member of the faculty teaching penmanship. At age 18, he made his first trip to Michigan, visiting an uncle in Jonesville. He then returned to Ohio for 3 years. In the fall of 1873, when 21 years of age, he returned to Jonesville and entered the law office of Witter J. Baxter and remained there 1 winter. He gave up the study of law in the fall of 1874 after a death in the family, which compelled him to move to his father's farm, who was then living just outside of Battle Creek. There he remained 4 years. In October 1878, he married Miss Mary Nye of Battle Creek, and he would eventually buy a farm of 115 acres in Penfield Township in 1879. While in Penfield, he was elected as a township supervisor in 1890 and was re-elected, serving 2 terms. Miles and Mary would have 2 sons, and they would remain on that farm until 1895 when they moved to Battle Creek. There, he went into business, becoming one of the founders of the Battle Creek Public Iron Works and served as a treasurer for that organization. He also invested as a part owner in the Ciro Fruit Company and the Battle Creek Whip and Leather Company. In 1894, he was elected to the state legislature. During his time there, he served on the State University Committee and the State Library Committee. He was also very active in opposing a bill to reduce the liquor tax from $500 to $300. In 1898, he was nominated and elected as a mayor of Battle Creek, and during his term, he saw to it that the city paid up its indebtedness, which amounted to $12,000. In doing so, he placed the city in a good financial basis. In 1906, he was appointed as postmaster by President Theodore Roosevelt, and again in 1910 by President William Howard Taft, and thus serving 8 consecutive years in that position in the community. He was well known in his time for his membership in the Knights of Pythius, a fraternal organization which was founded in Washington, D.C. in 1864 under a charter granted by President Lincoln. It was the first fraternal organization to receive a charter under an act of the U.S. Congress. It was founded by Justice H. Rathbone, who had been inspired by a play by Irish poet John Banham about the Greek legend of Damon and Pythius. The legend illustrates the ideals of loyalty, honor, and friendship at the center of the order. Here's some examples of the Knights of Pythius marching in parades in Wisconsin and also in Ohio. Miles was initiated in Lodge number 35 in Battle Creek in 1879 and remained an active member throughout most of his life. He rose to the state level with the organization, becoming Grand Keeper of the Records and Seal. All of the available photos on him show him in his Knights of the Pythian uniform. Miles was described in his biography as, "He does whatever he has to do with his whole heart and is never content with partial results. His well-balanced mind and excellent judgment made him a safe guide. While possessed of the courage of his convictions, he has the happy faculty of differing from one and yet not antagonizing his opponent. Above all, Miles is a gentleman." In 1929, Miles and Mary celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. Mary would pass away shortly after this celebration. In 1931, Miles married Sarah Nye Brownell, Mary's niece. Miles passed away in February 1943 at the age of 90 following a long illness. He was the oldest living former mayor and ex-postmaster at the time of his death in this city. Leonidas Dibble was born in Moravia, Cayuga County, New York, in January of 1834. His parents were Orasimus and Anne Maria Dibble. He obtained his education in the common school and prepared for college in the academy at Moravia. In 1841, he entered Geneva College in New York and graduated in August of 1845. He was the first in his graduating class in mathematics and ultimately became a professor in the subject at his alma mater. While working as a professor, he began to read law at the office of Whiting, Smith, and Whiting in Geneva and was
eventually admitted to the bar by the Supreme Court in New York in August of 1847. In the spring of 1848, he entered into a law partnership in Homer, New York. In December 1847, he married Miss Phoebe Antoinette Chatterton of Gaines, New York. Over the years that followed, they would have 3 children. In 1850, he was afflicted with the attack of gold fever and disposed of his property and interest in the law firm and journeyed to California with his father. They went by way of Panama before eventually arriving at the gold fields outside of San Francisco. He and his father show up in the 1850 census in California, listed as miners during that year. He remained in California for only a year, returning with sufficient gold dust to well pay him for the trip. Upon his return trip from California, he and his father visited relatives in Battle Creek, and he decided to settle here. In 1851, he entered into a partnership with Benjamin E. Graves in his law practice and continued in that practice until 1857, when Mr. Graves was elected to become a circuit judge. Mr. Graves would eventually go on to serve in the Supreme Court of Michigan. He continued to practice in the legal profession alone for several years and eventually took as a partner Henry Brown and Charles Thomas, and the firm would become Dibble, Brown, and Thomas. Following his move to Michigan, Leonidas was admitted to practice law in the state and federal courts in Michigan as well as Indiana. In 1862, he was captain of the Light Artillery Michigan State Troops, a position he had held for 5 years. At the outbreak of the Civil War, he raised Company C, 2nd Regiment Michigan Infantry in less than 24 hours, and subsequently, with his money and time and by addressing public meetings, assisted in enlisting several hundred other men for other Michigan regiments. From 1865 to 1873, he was a leader in organizing the Peninsular Railroad Company, a line that would eventually run from Lansing to Chicago. It would later become the Grand Trunk Railroad Company. He would serve as its president and counsel. During that time, he also raised the means, built, and equipped the railroads from Lansing, Michigan, to Valparaiso, Indiana, a distance of 166 miles. On the morning of September 14, 1865, he drove the first spike, which was gold-plated, in the construction of this railroad and shoveled the first shovelful of dirt in the presence of hundreds of people. In August 1872, he also became the general counsel for the Chicago and Lake Huron Railroad Company, which was formed out of this project. He was co-counsel in a high-profile murder case in Battle Creek, where Leonard Starkweather was charged with murdering his wife. She had been found beaten to death with a club, and witnesses said Mr. Starkweather had confessed to the crime. The trial played itself out in the 1858 newspapers, and the verdict of manslaughter was ultimately the decision by the jury. He also defended a man named Cotton in Berry County, who was charged with murdering a boy and received a similar verdict. He also defended several other murder cases during that same time period. Also, for 2 years, he served as the director of public schools in Battle Creek. And in 1876, he served on the centennial anniversary of American Independence Committee, in charge of raising money to meet the expenses of the celebration, along with 14 other prominent men in the community. At the request of the city, he delivered the centennial oration in Battle Creek on July 4th, 1876. He was selected to do so because of his intimate knowledge of local history. In 1879, he moved to San Antonio, Texas, and became one of the leading lawyers in that city. He founded the San Antonio Club, a social club in that city. Phoebe Dibble was still living in Battle Creek and passed away in 1882 at the age of 56 from heart disease. In the spring of 1897, he had a paralytic stroke and returned to Battle Creek and spent the last 4 years of his life being cared for by his daughter. Mr. Dibble passed away in December of 1901 at the age of 77 and was laid to rest at Oak Hill Cemetery. He was described in life as having a clear intellect, logical mind, and strong personal magnetism as the keynotes of his success in life. He was said to have the wonderful power to sway juries and inspire others in public assemblies with his confidence. Sadly, today in Oak Hill Cemetery, his gravestone is missing or has sunken from view. His mother, Anne Maria's stone, is the only one visible in the Dibble family plot. Adolph Johnson was often considered in his time to be an integral factor in the development of Battle Creek as a manufacturing and commercial center. He was born in northern Sweden in November 1866 and was the son of John and Christine Johnson. In his home country, during his boyhood days, he attended school until he was about 14 or 15 years old, when he then entered the machinist trade as an apprentice. He would serve 4 years as an apprentice, and as part of his arrangement would receive in return board and $300 in compensation for his service during this term. Upon completion of his apprenticeship, he worked in different cities as a journeyman, and after went into business on his own in Sundsvall, Sweden, where he operated this establishment for about 2.5 years. He then closed up his shop to become a superintendent in a larger business, but changed his mind after a few months and decided to seek his fortunes in America. During his immigration, his name was changed to Johnson. Before leaving Sweden, he was married in November 1889 to Miss Emma Allen. He crossed the ocean and landed in Boston, Massachusetts on the 25th of March, 1892. He did not remain long in this area, however, and traveled to Battle Creek, Michigan, where his wife had a sister living. Emma would later join him in September. In Battle Creek, he began working in a carriage factory before eventually securing employment at the Duplex Printing Press Company, remaining there until 1894. For a time, he also worked at a bicycle shop with his skills. He then moved to Michigan City, Indiana, where he began working for the Allen Manufacturing Company as an inspector of experimental tool work. He would remain with that company about a year, where he again moved to Jackson, Michigan, and worked for the Derby Manufacturing Company as a foreman. He later went to work for Kirk Manufacturing in Toledo, Ohio, until he returned to Battle Creek in the spring of 1900. At that time, he became a partner in the firm Johnson & Zock, manufacturers of general machinery on West Main Street. The operations began on a small scale, but from the beginning, the enterprise was a success after a year, and Mr. Johnson bought out his partner and expanded his business. He continued to operate the company under the name Johnson Machine Works. In March of 1902, the company was consolidated into the Battle Creek Foundry Company and later organized and incorporated under the name Johnson Foundry and Machine Works Limited. This same year, a large foundry building was erected that covered an area of 200 by 60 feet and was 2 stories high. The company manufactured special machinery, of which Mr. Johnson was the designer, most of which was used by the cereal industry. One of the successful inventions was the rotary flake toasting oven, which even at the time of his death many years later was still in use in many American and foreign cereal plants. The machine work, maintenance, and repair for the cereal business would constitute a large share of his business. The company's success was due to the innovative genius of Adolph Johnson, along with his practical knowledge. His personal attention to the business, along with keen perceptive management, allowed the company to be productive in the industry and remain capable of creating original designs. His company employed a number of skilled workmen and became one of the leading and recognized firms in his industry. Adolph and Emma would have one daughter named Elsa, who traveled to the U.S. with Emma when she was an infant. Their first child, a son, had died when they were still in Sweden. In addition to his commercial and residential property in the city, he owned a farm in Penfield Township. The hope that made him leave his native land and travel to America was ultimately realized through his hard work and industry. When he arrived in his new country, he was unfamiliar with the language and overcame that challenge to master English. His success in his business helped to not only innovate the cereal industry, but also raise him into a prominent position within the community. In his later years, one of Adolph's hobbies was the cultivation of flowers. and he was particularly interested in the cultivation of roses. Emma would pass away in May of 1947 at the age of 87 after failing health for over a year. Adolf passed away 1 year later at the age of 82 on his birthday. They are buried side by side in the family plot at Oak Hill Cemetery.
So that's going to conclude today's journey through history here at Oak Hill Cemetery. If you liked today's video, please take a minute to hit the like button down there, subscribe to the channel, share the video with others, and if you get a chance, check out my podcast at Tales of Southwest Michigan's Past. Thanks for watching.